So it brings us to this, this idea of like the trad wife, right? And it brings us to this idea of why women want traditional marriages, right? We see the faltering, the failures of all of the new modern ways of dating, the dating apps and hooking up, shacking up, breaking up. We're seeing how that's all faltering, and so women are sort of going back to this sort of funky, like I want to be a traditional wife. Now, again, some of the trad wife stuff, and you're seeing it here on the screen, is honestly really weird or creepy, but the sentiment is really important. I think the sentiment is important because it shows that women are saying, I want to go back to a day where I can just be a woman in the home and care for my husband and care for my kids and care for my home and make this place a great place for us to flourish. Is it for everybody? Of course not, right? We talk about predominantly but not exclusively. Like women have this pre-orientation, but it might not be for you. It's not the point. It's not that, but one thing that is for us is that we are supposed to care for our husbands and wives in that relationship and care for our children. So important thing is that you're ordering your life in such a way where those things can still happen. And so if you're sacrificing if you're sacrificing the ideal so you can earn more money, earn more cash, or so you can be a girl boss, or so you could basically split things 50-50 or whatever for the sake of equity or equality or egalitarianism, I would just say, man, that's a heck of a price to pay, right? It's a heck of a price to pay, and you're flipping a coin on whether or not you'd order your life well. But, can a wife work? Of course. Yeah. I mean, there's ways for all these things to work. I just think that it's important for us to consider. And I'd say for the men, if your wife has a calling to be in the home, to be, to be raising her children, to be caring for the home, to be a stay-at-home mother, so that way she can provide for her kids, you need to figure out a way to make that happen. I would say that it's not up for debate whether or not, cultural ideals of 50-50 and egalitarianism were the same. That is not that's not God's design for the biblical marriage. God's design for the biblical marriage is for us to to maintain our households, right? 1 Timothy 5:8, and to care for our children. If your wife's desire and her ability is to do that from home, then you need to make sure that as the sacrificial provider for the family, that you make that happen. And so, I've been quite honestly very discouraged by some posts I've posted on Instagram around this topic, around, husbands making a way for their wives to stay home. And what I've seen from the men is just this like, well, that's not possible. I can't do that. There's no way I'm going to be able to make enough money. She needs to go to work so we can live. I'm just trying to pay bills. And it's like such this melancholy, sad, like feeling bad for themselves sort of mindset where they have such limiting thoughts. And I went into that thinking, well, the issue is probably on men and women. But what I'm seeing is that, geez, men, you feel so bad for yourself. There are ways for you to earn more money. You do not have to stay at the same job. You are not a victim of your circumstance. You are not a victim to inflation. You're not a victim to Joe Biden or Trump or whoever who's like stopping you from being able to pay. So your wife has to work and your kids have to be in daycare or whatever. You've got to have the baby on your lap where you're working from home. Figure out a way as the sacrificial provider, right? Ephesians 5, as the sacrificial provider to go give yourself up and die for your wife so she can do what she feels called to do. If she feels called to it, make it happen. Go get another job, get 2 jobs, work your way up, get promoted. Is it going to happen overnight? If you're already there, probably not. Like maybe for some people, yeah, but probably not. If it can, great. But take the time, take the weeks and the months to figure out how this is going to happen, work your way up, earn more money so your wife can come home and do what she feels called to do instead of burning the candle at both ends. It's no wonder 50% of marriages end in divorce. It's no wonder 50% of marriages end because men don't want to make the sacrifice for their wives to do what they feel called to do. And you're like, I coach soccer after. It's like, well, stop coaching soccer. You say, well, I'm called to coach soccer. No, you're not. Not if your wife is struggling. You know what you're called to first? You're called first to provide for your family. 1 Timothy 5:8, if a person does not provide for the needs of their family, they're denied the faith and worse than an unbeliever. That's your first call. Your first call is to your wife and to your children, not to coach baseball or soccer or basketball or to really go work on your short game, or to go bowling with the buds, or go quadding, or whatever the heck else, your first call is to them. So it means that you're going to have to make more money. And then don't give me this bait and switch like, well, if I'm working all day, then my kids are never going to know me and they're going to turn on me. So what you're basically saying is, if you made that argument, it's that what you've basically said is the worst case scenario of this situation, which is that if I work too much and my wife stays home, my kids are going to resent me because all I do is work. That scenario is far worse than the best case scenario of me and my wife both working, where for some reason in this perspective, you and your wife work and the kids get to see and enjoy both of you equally somehow, but they're either in daycare or being raised by somebody else. Stop. You can't compare the worst version of this situation to the best version of this situation. The best version of the situation where your wife wants to stay home is that she lovingly leads the home, takes care of the children, and provides a great environment, whatever it is, however you guys decide to divide up all that stuff. And that you work really, really, really hard so that she can do that and your children grow up to see how sacrificial their dad is so they can have their mother around. Versus the worst version of, we're going to just both work and both be burnt out and both split all the housework and both split everything, and nothing really ever gets done because everything's done at 60% because we're doing too much and we're burning out, which is probably where you're at, because that's where most Americans are. If we're actually honest with ourselves and you're not making such an exorbitant income that your wife can have a nanny, or you can have a live-in grandparent or something like that, you're probably just stretched so thin that you don't know how to make it, and you're medicating with alcohol, or you're medicating with vacations, or buying all this other stuff. All that to say, men, you need to figure out a way to make this happen. And I'm not saying your wife has to be a trad wife and dressed in the 1950s garb. In fact, I think that's super weird. Unless she wants to, then do you. But my point is, you need to figure out a way to make it happen. On the flip side, there's an article here, Pew Research, August 3rd, 2023. I'll put it up on the screen for you. Here it is. Almost 1 in 5 stay-at-home parents in the United States are dads. So I posted an article, or a post on Instagram around how if a wife desires to stay at home with the kids, that a husband should try to make that happen. And I think that's true. And the response to a lot of that was from a bunch of men. And some of them were saying, well, what if I want to be the stay-at-home dad? And listen, I don't want to call balls and strikes where the Bible doesn't call balls and strikes, but this is a podcast. This isn't the pulpit. So I'm just going to tell you what I think. Genesis chapter 1 and 2, we see a clear cultural mandate. Adam's given a calling to work and to keep the garden. He has a calling from God before sin even enters the world. So what does that tell you, men? It tells you that men were designed for work. Eve shows up. Genesis 2, he finds a helper suitable for him. And they're sort of given this sort of shared calling to work and keep the garden right together, right? They've got different, distinct, unique roles and complementary roles in that process we just talked about. But they're made equal in the image and likeness of God, but they're different. But Adam, you've been given this call. It's really interesting to me. I'm just going to try to, maybe it's a correlation. I doubt it's a causation. Maybe it is. It's really interesting to me that when Genesis chapter 3 happens and Adam all of a sudden says, you know what, I think I'm going to abdicate responsibility. I think I'm going to sort of defer to Eve and allow her to eat this fruit, and then I'll sort of like passively go alongside her and then blame her on the back end. It's really interesting to me that men want to follow that same pattern. It's really interesting to me. You call it maybe a coincidence that all of a sudden men now want to stay at home with their kids, abdicate responsibility of their curse in Genesis 3, which is to, by the sweat of their brow, work the garden, thorns and thistles, all of that stuff, and give that to Eve, who, by the way, is more than happy to take on that responsibility right now and sort of take charge and take the lead. Also curious, because Eve did that in the garden. It's weird how we're sort of following that pattern. It's almost as if the Bible's trying to tell us something, like we're following this disordered pattern. But for you men, 1 in 5 parents are stay-at-home dads. Now, for a season, if there's an issue, are there exceptions to the rule? Obviously, there's men with I have a friend, some friends that at ALS, they can't work anymore. They're in between jobs, yada, yada, yada. They're starting a business. I'm not calling balls and strikes where where the Bible does. I don't want to do that. But I will say is that men are given a unique calling to work and keep the garden. You're biologically and chemically wired that way. And it's really bizarre that you would take that lead and then allow your wife to go out and get all the gray hair and be stressed out at her work and her job. And you say, well, but she loves the job. Maybe she does. Then order your life in such a way where she can do that job and you can also work and your kids are still cared for. But don't go sit at home all day and couch surf at your buddy's house and play video games and say, oh, God's designed this. God's designed the world like this for me. I just don't, I'm not buying that. I'm really not buying that. I'll read some of the articles. The share of parents in the United States who are not employed for pay has been fairly stable over the last 5 years. In 2021, 18% of parents didn't work for pay. And those 18%, and out of that, 1/5 of those were men, which is just such a fascinating thing. Over the past 30 years, the share of stay-at-home dads and parents has fluctuated during periods of higher unemployment. But it's fascinating to see that stay-at-home fathers are going up from only 3 to 4% in 1989 to almost doubling that 7 and change percent in 2021. That's a really interesting pattern. It's a really interesting pattern to see men want to stay at home